You're eating what? Stop eating genetically engineered foods, and please copy this for your friends. A presentation by Jeffrey Smith, author of the international bestseller Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of the genetically engineered foods you're eating. The recording was made at the Weston A. Price Conference held in Arlington, Virginia on October 3, 2004. You're encouraged to make copies of this audio presentation at no charge to give away to others.
We've heard a lot about genetically engineered food during the past 10 years. It's basically been the subject of the decade. And most of the criticism of genetically engineered food has focused on environmental destruction or the economics problems posed by genetically engineered food. We really haven't paid much attention to how these foods affect our health. That is why I was so pleased when Jeffrey Smith published his book, Seeds of Deception. He's done a remarkable job of pulling together a lot of research that's been hidden from the public to indicate the seriousness of the invasion of our food with these genetically modified organisms. Jeffrey Smith has been involved in activism against genetically modified foods for nearly a decade. This is his mission. In 1998, he even ran for U.S. Congress to raise public awareness of the health and environmental impacts of genetically modified food. He is a founding director of the Institute for Responsible Technology, a member of the Sierra Club Genetic Engineering Committee, and a member of the advisory board of the Campaign to Label Genetically Engineered Foods, as well as the author of the best-selling book, Seeds of Deception. So please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Smith.
Thank you. How many people are concerned about eating genetically modified foods? Wow. How many people are farmers? How many people are gardeners? How many people eat? So it's relevant. When I travel around the world, one of the aspects of my talks is after I describe death and disease and deception, I then have to pump people up to get them to change their diets. Now, the process of getting people to reject genetically modified foods was simple around the world. All it took was education. All it took in Europe was a skeptical press reporting on the potential health dangers or economic dangers or environmental dangers, but particularly health. People ask me, how come they're so concerned about genetically modified foods in Europe? Because they know about them. So I was reading the European press next to the US press for many years. I was working as the vice president of marketing for a GMO detection laboratory. I was a spokesperson on technical issues on the subject and interviewed around the world. And I realized that most Americans had no idea what a genetically modified food was. And if they did, we probably wouldn't have this problem. So I was also aware that there was incredible material out there for a fun book. There was a scientist who went public with his concerns and was fired from his job after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit. There was a UC Berkeley professor who was threatened by a senior Mexican government official who allegedly implied, "We know where your children go to school," trying to get him not to publish information. There were Canadian scientists who testified before the Senate saying they were offered a bribe by Monsanto, that documents were stolen from their office, that they were being pressured to approve genetically modified products, that whistleblowers at the FDA were fired, stripped of responsibilities, and forced out. I think this is good material. And I figured I would use this information as stories and then weave the description of the science and the dangers into those stories. But I knew from some friends of mine who had put out a book that was critical of Monsanto and genetic engineering, that 3 days before their book came off the printer, their publisher received a threatening letter from Monsanto's attorney, and the publisher decided not to go ahead with publication. So I decided to hide the book from the industry and not accept an offer for publication, but publish it myself. So when I sent the proofs out a year ago in the summer, I had shown it to very few people. And I was thinking it would have an impact, but I wasn't sure. Then I got my first call from a reporter, because I sent it just to media. And this is sort of how it went. He said, I just started reading the book last night at 11 o'clock. It's amazing. I never did this before. My girlfriend's been telling me about this for years. This stuff is incredible. This is evil. They're terrible. You know, like this was a reporter. He said to me, do you think I should write my congressman or senator? He said, I feel a moral responsibility to buy organic food from local farmers. I said, how much did you read? He said, 1 chapter. 2 hours later, I got my second call. It was from an editor of a magazine. He said, your book is perfect for my readers. They don't want to eat genetically modified foods, but they don't know why. I want excerpts in every article and every magazine I write. This is great. This is fantastic. I started reading at 11 o'clock last night. I never do that. I said, how much did you read? He said, 10 pages. That gave me an indication. I'm telling you this because what happened since September 1st of last year was that I've been on a continuous trip now. I've been to about 135 cities, some of them several times, in 16 countries on 5 continents, and this is my last talk in that marathon run. So I'm going to tell you some of that information, and you're going to obviously convert it into how you can make changes in your diet, and I'll explain how to do that as well. We'll go chronologically. We'll talk about, first, what happened in the 1980s. Individuals started going to doctors with a constellation of symptoms that the doctors had never seen in their practice. And the overriding symptom was intense pain, the worst pain that the doctors had seen in their careers. One person described how their legs blew up to the size of telephone poles and oozed water. There was progressive paralysis, where individuals eventually couldn't breathe without a respirator. People's hair fell out. There was a lot of mental problems. One person I spoke with was confined to bed for 6 months and took 2 minutes to turn from one side to the other because the pain was so intense. Well, because of a series of coincidences and because a little bit of the nature of this disease, they were able to find that there was an epidemic, because this was not a common thing. It was just scattered around the country. But they discovered that those who had this problem were taking L-tryptophan. How many people have heard of L-tryptophan? L-tryptophan is an essential amino acid. It's in turkey and milk naturally. But as the epidemiologist reported in a July article in 1990, it wasn't just tryptophan itself. It was a particular brand, 1 out of 6, that were being imported into the United States. And it was a Japanese company that was genetically engineering bacteria to produce the tryptophan more economically. Now, this process can lead to a lot of unpredicted side effects, which we can talk about. And this particular batch, or several batches, had contaminants. And this was almost certainly the result of genetic engineering, and the contaminants were almost certainly responsible for this deadly epidemic. It turns out about 5,000 to 10,000 people got sick. Some are still permanently disabled. About 100 people died. Now, the following month, after the first epidemiologist said in the article, this raises the question about the safety of genetically engineered foods. The FDA spokesperson in the next article said that this person should never have raised the issue of genetic engineering because of what it might do to the industry. This was an early indication of the side that the FDA was on and has remained on. In fact, it is their mandate to promote biotechnology. Well, there was a great and successful effort to divert the blame away from genetic engineering and claim that a change in the filter method at the factory in Japan in January 1989 was responsible for the epidemic. And this is what goes around the world. As I travel around the world, this is what comes back to me. However, we bring out new information in the book which shows that hundreds of people got the disease during the 4 years prior to the change in the filter. And that the information had been withheld by the FDA from the public and from Congress. It's interesting that that same deadly L-tryptophan were first introduced today, it would get on the market. Because it's not treated any differently because it came from genetic engineering. But the real lesson I take from this epidemic was that the reason why we were able to discover that there was an epidemic in the first place and then trace it to a genetically modified supplement was because the disease had three concurrent characteristics. It was rare, it was acute, and it came on quickly. What would happen if all three characteristics had not been in place? What if it took 20 years for onset, or the next generation? It would still be on the market. What if it were non-serious symptoms like frequent colds or memory loss? Maybe it's still on the market. What if it were serious symptoms that were common, like cancer or heart disease or obesity or diabetes? It would certainly not be discovered because it would be lost in the myriad of statistics we're now facing. So it begs the question, what of the thousands of products currently being fed to the U.S. citizens that contain ingredients from genetic modification? Maybe they're creating problems that don't have all three characteristics. Maybe they're responsible for the doubling of food-related illnesses in the United States between 1994 and 2001, corresponding to the times when a lot of these products were introduced. We don't know because no one is looking. One of the most unscientific statements made by the proponents of biotechnology is that millions of people have been eating them for years and no one has gotten hurt. Well, if you don't look, you won't find. And of course, there was those unfortunate victims of L-tryptophan. The FDA, when they were to introduce the first genetically modified bovine growth hormone from Monsanto, injected into cows to increase milk supply. The scientists who were concerned about its effects on health were fired, stripped of responsibilities, or forced out. The remaining whistleblowers had to write an anonymous letter to Congress claiming that there was fraud and conflict of interest at the agency. The milk from treated cows has higher levels of IGF-1, which a number of studies link to cancer. However, the FDA's official statement, which they suggest that's written on the side of cartons that would dare to label something as not from cows injected with RBGH, is that FDA shows no difference between the two, even though their own studies show that there is a difference. Now, what about the crops? They're the most well-known. Well, the FDA in 1992 put out their policy. And the policy states, the agency is not aware of any information showing that these foods differ in any meaningful or uniform way. It gives the impression that hundreds of scientists went out looking for differences and couldn't find any. And on the basis of this statement, they said, no testing necessary. No long-term safety testing, no short-term safety testing, no notification necessary. Which means if you create a genetically modified food in your basement laboratory, you can sell it in the United States without telling the Food and Drug Administration. And that is the basis of U.S. policy, and it's been repeated over and over again by U.S. trade representatives and senators and congressmen and ambassadors. However, a colleague of mine pioneered a lawsuit against the FDA. Tens of thousands of documents were made public. And what did it say? The compliance officer, summarizing all of the submissions by the scientists there, said, it is the understanding of the technical experts of the agency that these foods are different and lead to different risks. In direct contrast to the statement by policy. In fact, they listed those risks. They said it could give rise to hard-to-detect and unpredictable allergies, increase of existing toxins, introduction of new toxins, gathering of toxins from the environment, bioaccumulation of toxins in milk and meat, nutritional problems, new diseases, antibiotic-resistant diseases. They urged their superiors to require long-term safety studies. Their superiors, however, were not scientists. They were political appointees under direction from the White House to promote the biotechnology industry. And the person in charge of policy, his position had recently been created for him to be the person in charge of policy during the time that the FDA was looking at genetically engineered foods and drugs was Michael Taylor, former attorney to Monsanto. He later became a senior person at the United States Department of Agriculture working on biotech issues, and later became vice president for Monsanto. This is not uncommon. The current Secretary of Agriculture was on the board of Calgene. Now, Calgene is a subsidiary of Monsanto. And Calgene has an interesting history. They introduced the very first genetically modified crop to be reviewed by the FDA. And they did something different than any company has done since. They submitted detailed data to the FDA. See, if a company since then wanted to participate in the FDA's voluntary consultation, they can just choose whatever information they want, summarize it, give it to the FDA. If the FDA asks for further information, they're typically ignored. It's not required. Then they get a letter saying Monsanto believes its foods are safe. It doesn't say the FDA believes the foods are safe. It says Monsanto believes the foods are safe. But Calgene did something different. They gave animal feeding studies for their flavor saver tomato, fed to rats. Actually, the rats refused to eat the tomato. I think they missed a great marketing opportunity here. Don't you? I mean, are rats eating your tomatoes? Try our tomatoes. Even the rats won't eat them. In fact, eyewitness reports all over North America show that when given a choice, animals avoid eating genetically modified foods. Cows, pigs, geese, elk, raccoon, deer, mice, and rats. So my job is to get humans up to the level of animals. Well, they force-fed these rats the genetically modified tomato. Several developed stomach lesions, bleeding stomachs. 7 out of 40 died within 2 weeks. The tomato was approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Memos describe the statements by the scientists, whoever, which says this does not show a reasonable certainty of no harm. And the superiors approved it. This Calgene Flavor Saver tomato also was to be using the very first antibiotic-resistant marker gene to be inserted into food. Let me explain what that is. Let's say you wanted to create a genetically modified crop that produces its own pesticide. So you find a soil bacterium that produces this protein pesticide. You take the gene out which creates the pesticide, and you make changes in its genetic structure. You add an antibiotic-resistant marker gene, a promoter to switch the whole thing on, and typically you'd put thousands of these things in a gene gun. And you'd blast this gene gun into thousands of cells, hoping that some of your genes get into the DNA of at least some of those cells. This is the industry's precise method of insertion. Now, you can't tell which ones have gotten in, or where it's gotten in, or if it's made any disturbance to the DNA. So what you do is you douse the whole thing with antibiotics, killing them all, except very few. The few that survive because now they have an antibiotic-resistant marker gene inside the DNA, producing this protein, which renders it invincible to an antibiotic. So they asked the Division of Anti-Infective Drugs at the FDA, what do you think of the use of this antibiotic-resistant marker genes? They were appalled. They said in all capital letters in their memo, it would be a serious health hazard to introduce a gene that codes for antibiotic resistance into the intestinal flora of the general population. Can anyone guess why that's a problem? Well, the biotech industry assured the political appointees that it wasn't a problem, and they approved it. You see, the scientists were concerned that this gene would end up not only in the DNA of the transgenic plants, but it would somehow work its way into the DNA of pathogenic bacteria, probably inside our intestines. And that means that the bacteria, which was a disease, would no longer be able to be treated by those antibiotics. But the industry said not to worry, all DNA is destroyed during digestion in the stomach. So horizontal gene transfer is impossible. Well, there has been only a single human feeding study ever published on genetically modified foods. One. Published this year. sponsored by the pro-biotech UK government. They took 7 human volunteers and fed them soybean milkshake and soy burger. Now, soy is genetically engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup herbicide. You see, Monsanto found a bacteria growing in a dump site behind their factory that wasn't dying in the presence of Roundup. So they figured, let's put this in the food supply. So they took the gene that created the protein which created the invincibility to Roundup, and they took the gene and they blasted into the soybeans, and now 86% of all the soy in the United States is genetically engineered so that when you spray the field with Roundup, after the soy has emerged from the ground, the soy survives, but everything else living is dead, all the weeds. But what happens is they took this soy meal and fed it to these 7 human volunteers, and these volunteers had colostomy bags. They had their lower intestines removed. Not for the study. There were some ethics there, I don't know. And they looked into the colostomy bag, and they were surprised to find how much genetically modified DNA had survived digestion, passing through the stomach and the small intestine. They also took samples of the bacteria from the colostomy bag before and after the meal. And in 3 out of the 7 volunteers, some of their bacteria growing inside their intestines was now herbicide tolerant. The gene that had been growing in bacteria in a dump site, had been inserted into the soy, had now jumped from, at some previous time, was there on a stable basis, from some soy that they had eaten to their gut bacteria. What are the medical implications of that? Well, we don't know. I'll give you some potential problems. You see, that protein, which results in herbicide tolerance, has never before been part of the human food supply. It might be an allergen. Human beings typically take repeated exposure in order to develop allergies. So there's no guaranteed tests that you can do on novel proteins to verify that they are not allergenic. The World Health Organization and United Nations have a list of criteria designed to minimize the likelihood that these new genetically modified proteins would create an allergy. The soy protein would fail that criteria. Because 2 sections of its amino acid structure are identical to 2 known allergens, a shrimp allergen and a dust mite allergen. So now we have that protein being produced inside our gut bacteria, possibly long after we decide not to eat genetically modified soy again. We don't know because it was just a pre and post test some hours apart, maybe a day apart, but we've never checked in the long term. Now, another problem is with this protein, when they insert this gene that creates the protein, they've expected that gene to be stable, and they actually registered its sequence, and now, as of June of last year, they found that the sequence is changing. Not only changing in one direction, but 2 different labs found it changed in different ways. So now you have the 2003 Indiana version of the soybean, the 2004 Iowa version of this gene. When the gene changes, so does its protein it creates. So the protein structure is not the one that was intended, and it was never tested. So we don't know which of these proteins or what they are that may be being produced inside our guts from the DNA that now has these genes in the bacteria. So those are some pretty substantial potential long-term problems. What also transferred with the gene into the bacteria was something called a promoter. That's added to the gene that you put in to turn it on. You see, typically inside a DNA, I'm sure you've all seen this, there's this person back there. They set the levels of all the genes. They get a printout. What time is it? How old am I? What part of the physiology am I in? Am I under attack? This whole thing is just very well calculated, and they figure, okay, they set the levels of which genes are expressing their proteins and how much. Then this foreign gene comes in that was not part of the billions of years of evolution of that particular species, and it's unrecognized. So what engineers do is they put in a permanent artificial on switch, which turns on this gene 24/7 around the clock, full volume. So it produces its protein at top volume no matter what. They assumed that it would only turn on the gene to which it was attached. It can sometimes turn on genes in the DNA at random permanently, at full volume. So now in the corn plant or the soy plant or the cotton plant or the canola plant or the papaya plant or the zucchini plant or the crookneck squash, those are the 7, we'll go over it again. Those may have genes inside their DNA which are now on at full blast. And so this person back there is saying, okay, enough. And the gene is saying, I'm sorry, you're not in charge anymore. He is. You look over and it's this foreign promoter. And what can it be overproducing? Allergens, toxins, carcinogens, anti-nutrients, something great. We don't know. It's genetic roulette. The promoter transfers to gut bacteria. It might turn on genes at random inside the bacteria. Preliminary evidence released in February at the UN Biosafety Protocol Conference meetings in Malaysia described how the promoter was found in rat organs after the rats were fed a single transgenic meal. If the promoter were to transfer to our DNA, it could, in theory, turn on genes at random permanently. It also has, in theory, a hotspot which can cause recombination and mutation. So it could also mess up the structure of our DNA. It also can, in theory, awaken dormant viruses embedded within the DNA. Now, because we know that the soybean gene transferred, of course we know that the antibiotic-resistant marker genes might transfer, but they never followed up to find out. And that could be creating super diseases. What about the gene that creates its own pesticide that's being used in corn and cotton right now? What if that were to transfer to our gut bacteria? It could render our intestinal flora as living pesticide factories. If you ask the Environmental Protection Agency, which is in charge of this pesticide-producing plants, about this, they'll tell you it's all destroyed during digestion. Now, this particular pesticide, Bt, is used in organic agriculture, but it's a different structure when it's created in the food, and some describe it as a lot more toxic, potentially. When they fed Bt to mice, it did survive digestion. In fact, they had abnormal and excessive cell growth in their small intestines. They had an immune response equal to that of cholera toxin. They had an increased susceptibility of allergens. Preliminary research released also in February describes how 39 Filipinos living next to a Bt cornfield developed skin, respiratory, and intestinal reactions and fever while the corn was pollinating. Blood tests verified that their blood had an immune response to the Bt. Now, these are just some of the ways that genetic engineering can cause problems. We know that even though they're doing no monitoring whatsoever of human health, if you look just at the statistics, soon after genetically modified soy was introduced to the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed by 50%. Is this due to the novel protein that has identical sections to the known allergens? Or maybe a variation of it that's changed over time? We don't know. But we do know that the process of insertion of a gene into the DNA is not Legos. You don't just snap it into place and add a trait, which is what the industry wants us to believe. The process itself is a violent change. It can damage the DNA. It can also change the levels of expression of lots of the existing genes. A gene chip study monitored the expression of proteins in the DNA before and after a single gene was inserted, and 5% of the genes that were expressing proteins changed their levels of expression. This is huge. This is why, in spite of the title of Monsanto's study in the Journal of Nutrition, that their herbicide-tolerant soy was equivalent to the natural soy, it showed embedded within hard-to-read tables that there was differences, including the increase of trypsin inhibitor, one of the most well-known allergens in soy, which might be responsible for the increase in allergies, in soy allergies in the UK. They also referred to other information from their studies where plants were grown side by side in identical conditions, which would give a lot more information, which they didn't even include in the study. Someone had to dig it out of the archives years later and make it public, and it showed that once the soy was heated, the difference in trypsin inhibitor was 3 to 8-fold. Also, there was a lectin, which is a potential anti-nutrient, that had increased. There was also a decrease in protein, a decrease in phenylalanine. There's a lot of differences there, which they left out under the title of their paper, which was that there was no difference, or basically they were equivalent. So there could be a lot of changes in the nutrient levels, but they don't check all the nutrient levels. They just check a few. So there could be changes in things we don't even know exist, which might have impacts on health, mood, behavior, reproduction. We don't know. They also discovered a section of the DNA of the genetically modified soy in recent years after it was introduced, which is damaged. It became damaged due to the process of insertion. It's long enough to create its own potential protein, which could, of course, be allergenic. That might be the reason for the increase in allergies. We just don't know. There's too many possibilities here. Remember that the FDA had said, one person said, it's not possible to ask these manufacturers to be able to determine if their foods are allergenic. And yet, there's no long-term safety studies. So, actually, there have been a few long-term safety studies. When I published my book, there were 10 published animal feeding studies on genetically modified foods. 8 were conducted with industry money, 2 were independent. Now, there's an interesting coincidence about results. Aspartame. How many people have heard of aspartame here? Everyone should know aspartame. Well, I read that it was the subject of 166 studies between 1985 and 1995, divided almost equally between industry-sponsored studies and independently sponsored studies. 100% of the independent-sponsored studies raised questions about aspartame, including the possibility that it might create brain tumors. It's, by the way, a result of the process of genetic modification. Guess what percentage of industry-sponsored studies raised questions? 0. So of these 10, let's focus on one of the independent studies. A man named Arpad Pusztai, a scientist working at the most prestigious nutritional research laboratories in Europe, he is the top of his field in research in a particular type of protein. And he had published more than 300 studies in 12 books. And he was selected by the UK government to lead a UK-funded study to determine what the ideal testing protocol would be of every genetically modified crop before it was allowed on the market by the UK government. This protocol was to be adopted by Europe. He won the prestigious grant over 27 competitors because the government felt like if he gave his seal of approval, their skeptical public would start to eat genetically modified foods without concern. So he and his team worked on developing the testing protocol, which the FDA scientists had asked for and urged their superiors to implement, but were ignored. And he genetically engineered a potato to produce an insecticide and put it through the protocol of tests, and was surprised to find that the rats were damaged. When he took potatoes and spiked it with the insecticide, the rats were not damaged, nor were the rats that just ate the potatoes. In all cases, they were given a completely balanced diet. So what was the cause of the problem? If it wasn't the insecticide, it was likely to be the process of engineering the potato to produce the insecticide. And he used the same process that's used to create the foods on the market. He went public with his concerns, was a hero at his institute for about 2 days, and then 2 phone calls were allegedly forwarded from the Prime Minister's office through the receptionist to the director on a Tuesday afternoon. Wednesday morning, Arpad Pustai was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. The 20-member research team was disbanded, and the UK government did not put into place the testing protocol. He was eventually invited to speak before Parliament, which lifted the gag order. He received his data back. It's published in The Lancet, a prestigious journal, and it remains the most in-depth animal feeding study ever conducted on genetically modified foods. I asked Arpad, what was your most shocking moment? What was your most dramatic moment, the biggest shock you had? Can anyone guess why I asked that question? Remember, I was writing a book. Remember, I'm looking for shocking stories to write things about so people will read it, because no one's going to read a textbook on genetic engineering. Well, perhaps I was the only person that asked him that question because he had told me something he had not told any other investigator. Months earlier, while he was still on good terms with everyone, this pro-biotech scientist was sitting in his office, and the director of the institute, Professor Philip James, walked into the office and put down a stack of about 700 pages on Arpad's desk. Arpad's wife, Susan, came in. She's a senior researcher there also. The director explained, these are the submissions from the 6 or 7 biotech companies to the UK government for their genetically modified foods. Now, the director was one of 12 committee members that approved these. And the director said the Minister of Agriculture is meeting in Brussels to discuss genetic engineering and have a vote, and he wants a scientific opinion on these. Arpad looked at the stack of 700 pages and looked at his director and realized this man would never read that many pages. He was not a working scientist, he was a committee man, as were the rest of the 12 members of this committee. Arpad and his wife, however, had spent the previous 2 years creating the ideal testing protocol for genetically modified foods. So he was very interested in evaluating what the industry considered appropriate, and he and his wife were among the most qualified humans on earth to do so. So he said, how much time do we have? And the professor said, 2.5 hours. So they got to work and they looked immediately at the design and the data. And Arpad Pustai said to me, that was the most shocking moment. More shocking than being fired from his job. More shocking than discovering the damage to the rats. Because he realized how poor the science was being done by industry. He said, you know what good science is and you know bad science, and this was bad science. Flimsy, superficial. He said, I realized what they were doing and what I was doing was diametrically opposed. What I was doing was safety studies. What they were doing was as little as possible to get their foods on the market as quickly as possible. He called the minister and said, I wasn't expecting to give you a strong recommendation after only 2.5 hours, but I have to say there is definitely not enough information here to allow these foods to be fed to human beings or to animals. The minister said, I don't know why you're telling me this. Your professor's committee approved these foods 2 years ago. They're already on the market. A few weeks later, when Arpad realized the extent of the damage to his rats, potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, he realized that that potato, if submitted to that same industry research, would have made it to the market. And that's where it was intended to go. However, he also realized that the soy, corn, and tomatoes that did make it to the market were never tested for these things. And they were created from the same process that he used to create his potato. And they still haven't been tested for these things. And remember, it wasn't the insecticide that caused the problem for the potatoes. It was likely the process. Now, the tomato's been taken off the market. It was a flavor saver tomato engineered for longer shelf life, but evidently it didn't work because it's not on the shelves anymore. But there are very few other studies. We know, even though many of these are rigged to avoid finding problems, according to scientists who reviewed them, rats that were fed genetically modified soy had problems in misshapen components in the nucleus of their liver cells. Rats fed genetically modified canola had livers that were 15% heavier. Rats fed genetically modified corn had problems in the development of their blood cells, with their kidneys, and higher blood sugar levels. Rats fed genetically modified tomatoes, as we talked about, had stomach lesions. 7 of 40 died within 2 weeks. Twice the number of chickens fed genetically modified corn died when compared to those fed non-genetically modified corn. 12 cows died mysteriously in Germany when fed genetically modified corn. Several others had to be killed because they were sick. I spoke with farmers recently in Iowa, representing about 25 farmers so far in the Midwest, who've identified that feeding certain genetically modified corn varieties to their animals has caused their animals to have reproductive problems. Primarily with pigs, unable to get pregnant. Either they were giving birth to bags of water or had false pregnancies. They looked like they were pregnant, and all of a sudden they weren't pregnant at the end. Cows gave birth to 20 times the amount of twins in this one farm, and others had trouble reproducing. So we're in a situation where we are shaking up and rolling the dice on the DNA. The DNA makes changes in the physiology of the plants that we eat, which are not being studied. The genes transfer to gut bacteria and likely to internal organs, which could make changes in the DNA there, which are not being studied. So, even though I consider this to be one of the most serious health and environmental dangers we now face, unlike many other problems in the environment, this is one of the easiest battles to win. Simply by informing people of the health dangers, and simply by taking steps to protect ourselves and our families, we can bring down this dangerous experiment. And I'm not speaking just theoretically, I am describing what happened in Europe. In April 1999, Unilever, Britain's largest food manufacturer, committed to remove all genetically modified ingredients from their European brands. Within 1 week, every major food company in Europe followed suit. McDonald's, Burger King, Safeway, Nestle's, for their European brands. Because in Europe, people learned about this. Studies show that the more people learn about genetically modified foods, the less they trust them. Imagine that. In the United States, a recent study showed that more than 50% of Americans say they've never eaten a genetically modified food in their lives. Most Americans eat them in every meal. You know how extensive soy is in the diet. Unless it says non-GMO or organic, it will be genetically engineered. Same with corn. High fructose corn syrup, maltodextrin, dextrose, corn flour, corn oil. And there's canola, and there's cotton for cottonseed oil, Hawaiian papaya, a little bit of zucchini and crookneck squash, and Quest brand tobacco. There used to be a potato that was taken off the market. A rice has been approved but not commercialized. Wheat was being threatened by Monsanto until the entire wheat industry virtually erupted in concern, and they withdrew temporarily their bid to commercialize it next year. So we're facing a situation, fortunately, where consumer concern is growing around the world. Nearly 2,000 jurisdictions in Europe have declared themselves GM-free zones in 22 countries. There are GM-free zones being established or already established in parts of New Zealand, the states of Australia, Venezuela, most of Brazil, Angola, Sudan, Zambia, Mendocino County, California, Trinity County, California, and on the ballot of 4 other counties in California, where I just came from 2 days ago, speaking and listening to the rhetoric of the biotech industry, claiming that these foods are safe and been proven safe by the FDA, even though in the lawsuit against them, they defended themselves by saying the FDA does not regulate genetically modified foods. So there's a lot of myths out there. So my job is to pierce the myths. And I'm happy to say it's working. And I'm going to offer you tools to help get this word out. Because in Chapter 7 of my book, I describe muscling the media, how documentaries and And news reports and books and articles have been squashed because of threats from Monsanto's attorneys or others, and how there really is a concentration of media ownership that was diverting the attention away from these issues. So that's why I wrote the book, and I'm happy to say it's become a book that's shaping policy around the world. It's been translated into 6 languages. It's the best-selling book on the topic, and you can also sign up for my free electronic newsletter. I just created a video that'll be out this month. It interviews a lot of the scientists around the world, and the first of the 2 videos is aimed at taking GM foods out of school meals. Yeah, kids are most at risk for sure. I also recommend getting on an email list with regular news updates. There's 2 sites that do that well. One is GM Watch. It's a British one. It's beautiful. You can take it weekly or daily. I think it's gmwatch.org. The other is thecampaign.org. It's the campaign to label genetically engineered foods. I strongly recommend that you get on one of these 2, and my own as well, because you hear it today, and then as the days pass, it becomes less and less, and then it goes away. And this is not something that we can allow that to happen, because we're making changes not just for this generation, but potentially for all future generations, because we're giving pollution with legs. We're giving this transgenic pollution that self-replicates. Imagine being hired by a new boss, saying, "You're an environmentally minded person. We'd like you to do a little project for us. We'd like you to recall our genetically modified salmon from the ocean, or mosquitoes, which are planned for release, or the pollen, which has contaminated Mexico's indigenous corn varieties." It's not possible. At least we don't know today how to do it. And yet we're putting these crops out. We're feeding the products of an infant science to millions of people and releasing them into the environment where they can never be recalled. The genetic engineering science is based on theories that were popular 40 years ago, but have been overturned. One professor said to the class as he introduced me at the University of Texas, "Everything we knew about genetics 10 years ago is wrong. Everything we know today about genetics will be considered wrong in 10 years. And we're manipulating the DNA and putting it out there." So that's why I chose to focus on this, because I see on a triage, what do we have to handle first? This is one of the things that cannot wait. So I'd like to recommend that you take steps to avoid eating these foods and to share this information with others. And I have a program if you want to buy my book. It's cheaper by the half dozen. And this is something which has been very popular because people realize they take a level of empowerment to actually help get the word out. It's cheaper by the case. I'll send you a train load. We're just trying to pump out the information to break through what's been basically a blackout by the U.S. media. And as you can tell from the information I presented so far, it's very serious and it demands immediate attention. And I'm really grateful for this forum to allow me to present it. Thank you.
Before we continue with the questions and answers, I want to suggest another way you can help get the word out. You're welcome to make copies of this audio presentation to give away. You can give them to friends, to parents' groups, restaurant and food store owners, politicians, media, and include them with birthday or holiday presents. You can also download the audio file from www.seedsofdeception.com, along with artwork for a label and a jewel case insert. Or to save time, we sell bulk quantities of professionally made CDs just above our cost. Go to seedsofdeception.com or call toll-free 888-717-7000. 888-717-7000. Now we'll go back to hear the answers to audience questions, which will be read by the narrator.
What do you say to someone who says we've been genetically manipulating plants for thousands of years through hybridization? I've got a friend who doesn't think it's a big deal. What's the difference?
We've been genetically engineering plants for thousands of years. This is a mythology, one of the 5 or 6 most popular ones. In fact, you can just turn it on TV, it used to be, and you can get this kind of thing. The FDA's own scientists said it was different and could lead to different risks, and described them as allergies, toxins, new diseases, antibiotic-resistant diseases, and nutritional problems. Nobel laureates agreed that we're creating new organisms that were not part of the billions of years of evolution in a single stroke. And it's fundamentally different. Even someone that created the collusion tomato, who wrote a book about it, said to me, and we know it's not an extension of natural breeding. She rolled her eyes as she parodied what has become a PR standard. So just those references alone should be able to at least raise the doubt. But again, you're going against a $50 million a year marketing campaign. And they spent $142 million in 2001 lobbying Washington, D.C. And many of the people in Washington were former or future biotech executives. Dan Glickman, former Secretary of Agriculture under the Clinton administration, a big biotech cheerleader, traveled around Europe saying you must eat genetically modified soybeans. He admitted before stepping down from office, he said, what I saw generically from the pro-biotech side was the technology was good and that it was almost immoral to say that it wasn't good, because it was going to solve the problems of the human race and feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And if you're against it, you're Luddites, you're stupid. And that, frankly, was the side our government was on. He said you felt like you were almost disloyal and alien by trying to present an open-minded view. So this is what we are up against, a very successful marketing campaign, which can be pierced with information and facts.
Have a website with sources or references I can use?
Yes. My website is seedsofdeception.com, but most of the citations are actually in the book. And I was very careful. When I'm going against deception, distortion, and denial, I had to be really, really careful with my information sources. So I asked this top biologist from Germany to please write the foreword to my German edition. And she said to me, you know, I can't put my name on anything that has any problems with the science. So I'll look at your book, but I'll look at it very carefully. And if it has any problems, I can't sign it. And I said, great. If you find any problems, I'll make changes, make a correction on my website. So I saw her in Brussels. And later I saw her at the UN Biosafety Protocol Conference in Malaysia. And she said, well, I've gotten through the book, but now I'm having another top biologist look at it, looking at every one of your citations, your quotes, going back to the original source to make sure you don't quote anyone out of context. So I said, this is great. Well, it came out 2 weeks ago and her name is on it.
What are the GM food crops that have been genetically engineered?
The crops. Soy, corn, cotton, and canola. The major four. Soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Everyone. Soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Okay. And then there's the soy and corn offspring, which there's a list. You can get it on the back of my book, on the website. I've mentioned some of them. Then there's the 3 minor food crops, Hawaiian papaya, which they found, by the way, in the Big Island. They just took nearly 20,000 papaya seeds. 80% from organic farms, 20% from gardens and wild papaya. And they tested them, and half were genetically engineered. So, Hawaiian papaya, and a small amount of zucchini and crookneck squash. And of the corn, of the sweet corn variety, only 3 to 5% is genetically engineered. The rest are either used for animal feed or for the derivative.
Are GM crops economically advantageous?
Economics was the reason why the United States government pushed it. The Council of Competitiveness under Dan Quayle, under Bush 1, said we need to promote U.S. exports, and they identified genetically engineered crops as one of their key technologies. And on that basis, they put through no real regulation. And it's been an economic disaster. Corn growers lost their $300 million a year European markets. Canada lost its canola markets and its honey from canola. The soy market share dropped from 57% down to 5th to 46%. The amount of subsidies of farmers has gone up about $2 to $3 billion, specifically tied to loss of markets of the genetically modified crops. There's also a reduction in yield on average for genetically modified crops. And it's only 4 to 6%, sometimes say up to 10% for soy. It's reduction in canola. It sometimes increases in yield sometimes increases in corn if there's an infestation of European corn.
What does the food industry say about these foods?
The food industry really considers this a pain in the neck, and I'm being tactful in my choice of words, because they don't gain any benefits whatsoever from serving genetically modified foods, and now they have to create two different brands, one to go to Europe and the rest of the world, and one to stay in the United States. They have to pay extra to do segregation. There's no traits that are out there that benefit them. The two major traits are herbicide tolerance. About 84% of the plants are herbicide tolerant, which means you have to buy the company's herbicide that sells you the seed. And about 20% it creates its own pesticide. And there's a disease resistance in the papaya, zucchini, and crooked squash, but that represents a tiny fraction. So the industry has been very upset by it. Of course, the biotech industry, they wanted to genetically modify 100% of the world's commercial seed supply and patent it. That was their goal. It still is their goal. But they're in a very vulnerable situation right now because the market is shrinking. And the U.S. consumers are becoming more aware of it. So it's a huge food fight right now.
How is the market shrinking?
Japanese manufacturers have told the U.S. not to send them genetically modified products. They have a labeling regime which allows 5% contamination, which is very high. The labeling issue, citizens around the world don't want to eat genetically modified foods. 92% of Americans want it labeled. More than half say they wouldn't eat it if it were labeled. And the labeling concept that most people share is if it's derived from genetic modification, we want it labeled. But a lot of labels around the world have loopholes. If something is processed into oils, it's not labeled because there's no DNA in there and you can't find the transgenic protein. But because you're changing the DNA of these soy and corn, cotton and canola, you could be making vast changes in its nutrient levels which could show up in the oil. So it's still a myth that the oils or processed foods aren't affected. So Europe has modernized its labeling regime. It went into effect in April. And now, if it's derived from genetic modification, it has to be labeled. So that's a way in which the market is shrinking. Another way that it's shrinking is that a lot of these foods go into animal feed, soy and corn in particular. And so Europeans are now becoming sensitized to the fact that the milk and meat that they consume is coming from animals fed genetically modified feed. And they're starting to demand more and more. So a lot of the activist work in Europe is to try and increase the spectrum of rejection. And they're having a lot of success.
What are some of the implications to farmers of patenting life forms?
Percy Schmeisser, a famous Canadian farmer, canola grower, seed saver, seed developer, had his crops contaminated with Monsanto's herbicide-tolerant canola. It doesn't die when sprayed with Roundup. And he was sued by Monsanto because Monsanto said it's their intellectual property on his fields. And the Canadian Supreme Court upheld that. Now, at the same time, the organic canola growers have been devastated in Saskatchewan because they can't get any pure seed. So it's wiped out their industry. So they're in a class action suit against Monsanto and Bayer Crop Science to recover damages. So it is a litigious situation, and it's remarkable about what patenting life has resulted in. I mean, 1,000 of the genes inside all of us are owned by various companies.
I want to say that when I went to Europe, even in restaurants, menus say that they don't use genetically modified foods. They call them frankenfoods.
This is a policy statement from one UK restaurant in 1999. In response to concern raised by our customers, we have decided to remove as far as possible genetically modified soy and maize from all food products served in our restaurant. We will continue to work with our suppliers to replace GM soy and maize with non-GM ingredients. We have taken the above steps to ensure that you, the customer, can feel confident in the food we serve. The statement was in reference to the cafeteria of Monsanto's UK headquarters.
A couple of years ago, I read about the Terminator gene. Can you tell us about that and whether they have put that into production yet?
The Terminator gene. The Terminator gene is a way in which the biotech industry does not have to have farmers sign a pledge, which they do now, not to save their seed and replant it. See, there's a whole thing you sign when you buy Roundup Ready or one of these genetically modified crops. It says, I'll only buy the company's version of the herbicide. I will allow inspectors on my property to come at any time and inspect my plants, even my tax returns or information, and that I will not sue the biotech company, and anything that we talk about or settle will be remain quiet. And there's even hotlines, 800 hotlines for farmers that if they think one of their neighbors is saving seed, they get to call Monsanto and get a free leather jacket. And there's a lot of intimidation and intimidating letters in Pinkerton and former Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Anyway, to avoid that and to gain a greater grip, particularly for the developing countries where seed saving is traditional, for 1.4 billion people on Earth are fed from farmers that save their seed, they've got these technologies not yet introduced that will cause sterility of the seed, so that after you plant it, it won't be able to grow the next year. Now, of course, contamination happens. There's this mythology about buffer zones. Think of Hawaii. It used to be pure lava rock. It's now a lush tropical paradise more than 2,000 miles away from mainland. Consider buffer zones.
Yeah.
So you know if they have these sterile seeds in one field, it's going to end up contaminating the seed supply, forcing farmers to have to buy the biotech seeds or having them plant and just find that a certain percentage died inexplicably. Anyway, this is just a little window into the world that I've been focusing on, but I think it is a very critical thing because it's a self-replicating, long-term, and invasive technology dealing with the fundamental level of biology and of our ecosystem. And it's something which is reflective of a way of thinking. And I think it's, to some extent, one of the most extreme ways that we are being careless with ourselves, our environment, and our future. So I wish you safe eating. Thank you.